of today, we are less than a month from the climate conference in Copenhagen. So what I thought I'd try to do by way of a backgrounder, this is going back to my instincts that this is something like what we used to do in the 60s. There used to be things called teach-ins, where lots of people would come voluntarily to learn about an issue. So let's just assume for a moment I'm going to just lay out a bunch of background information and hope that some of it's what you are interested in. And I'll find out when I open it up for questions if I was on the right track. There's two tracks going on here that tell us that Copenhagen and the climate negotiations are heading to a deadline. And one of the things that distressed me about the Globe and Mail editorial last week was the notion that if we were having trouble reaching the targets that had been set, it was time for new targets. So I want to try to make it clear why it is that we don't have any more flexibility around these issues. These deadlines are real. And these two tracks, one comes from the world of human institutions, nation-state to nation-state negotiation that have picked a deadline, and I want to let you know how that happened. And then the effective real deadline created by the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and our understanding, imperfect as it is, of when we go so far that nothing we do will make a difference, where those, in other words, where those tipping points are and how to avoid them. So let's start with where we started in Canada, which was in this city in the last week of June in 1988. That was a very important conference. It was actually the first global scientific conference on the climate issue that was convened in such a way that it would be comprehensive. There had been smaller groups of international scientists that met before then, but at the Toronto Convention Centre in the last week of June 1988, the Government of Canada and two UN agencies hosted a real landmark event. Now, it was on the climate crisis, but the title of the conference was Our Changing Atmosphere, Implications for Global Security. Now, I think we can now recognize it would have been good if we had been able to keep the focus on security, because as an environmental issue, no politician remains interested for very long, but if it's a security issue, the attention span gets longer. In any case, this is the all-encompassing security issue of our time, and back in 1988, that was what the conference was called, and it was key for a couple of reasons. One was that it was the first conference at which any attempt at setting a target was made. So the scientists from around the world, with some other policymakers, tried to figure out what we should do, given that no one was really debating that if we kept adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, we would have a destabilized climate and significant threats to well-being around the world. As a matter of fact, it was at that conference, the last week of June 1988, the only real debate among the scientists was, are we already seeing the effects of human-induced climate change? And the first person to say we were, I don't know how many of you remember the very well-respected, eminent Dr. Ken Hare, who was at that conference the first scientist to say, yes, we are already seeing anthropogenic climate change impacts, and it was a heat wave that week, and he said this is one of them. That was going out on a limb, but he's since passed away, but I think it's worth remembering how many strong and eminent scientific voices from Canada have been warning us for so long. So the scientists gathered there said as a first step, as a modest first step to avoid dramatic climate crisis impacts, we should reduce greenhouse gases to 20% below 1988 levels by 2005. 20% below 88 levels by 2005. Now that wasn't a target accepted by government in Canada. It was accepted by the City of Toronto. It became known as the Toronto Target, and it made its way in to Jean Chrétien's first Red Book in '93. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I also wanted to share with you what the scientific consensus statement from that conference said, because there's never been a better single sentence written since about the nature of climate change as an issue and burning of fossil fuels creating a destabilized global climate system. What the scientists there said is, quote, humanity is conducting an unintended, uncontrolled, globally pervasive experiment whose ultimate consequences could be second only to global nuclear war. Now, bear in mind, this is 88. That was before the Berlin Wall fell. We had a very strong call to action out of the 1988 conference, and it's no exaggeration to say that it contributed to the formation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that it helped to drive a process that led to a commitment coming from the United Nations General Assembly, that, of course, and the very powerful impact of the Brundtland Report in 1987, that we would hold a world conference to deal with this issue and others in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. So between 1990 and 1992, the governments of the world were negotiating the first climate treaty. So if we start from that first meeting to develop a framework convention on climate change, the negotiations started in the month of August 1990. We've been at this for more than 19 years. I think that's worth remembering when people say we have to remember these things take time. We've been negotiating since August 1990. Now, they fast-tracked the negotiations on the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we actually had a treaty ready to sign, which especially in hindsight is something of a miracle, that is still the governing document for what we're doing. It was signed and ratified by Canada. Canada was the first industrialized country not just to sign but also to ratify. We ratified within 6 months so that we'd ratified within calendar 1992. Pretty fast work. The Framework Convention on Climate Change says everything that we already, but we still find our politicians and media acting as if we don't know this already. So let's just review what the Framework Convention on Climate Change has committed Canada by law to understand that the climate crisis is real, that burning fossil fuels is dangerous, that destroying our forests is dangerous, and that we have a collective global responsibility to act, and that we must not use some level of uncertainty that may exist around the margins as an excuse for inaction. We committed ourselves in 1992 collectively as a world community to reduce greenhouse gases such that whatever new level of greenhouse gases stabilized in the atmosphere, we would do so at levels before they became dangerous. That's actually the word used in the convention, the word dangerous. Now, the convention did not include timelines, targets, deadlines. So it exhorted everyone to good behavior, and people committed to good behavior. It was legally binding, but without targets and timelines, hard to measure, but a major accomplishment. And it created this process, which continues to this day, so that once a country signs and ratifies a treaty, that country is called a party, and every year, once the treaty entered into force, there's been essentially a mini climate parliament called the Conference of the Parties. So you can mark the seminal events along the road we've been on by what number COP it was, Conference of the Parties. It was the third COP that was held in Kyoto, Japan, where the targets and timelines were built in a protocol within the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was the 11th Conference of the Parties in Montreal in 2005, late November and early December 2005, was the first COP where the Kyoto Protocol had finally come into force. Because despite all the efforts to blow it up and throw it off the rails from the Bush administration, when Russia finally ratified, the Kyoto Protocol became legally binding. Most of the countries, by the way, that took on targets in the Kyoto Protocol have met their targets. So at that Montreal meeting in 2005, there was a tremendously jammed agenda. This is the first meeting that was held with the Kyoto Protocol having come into effect. So that's how these things move forward slowly. And at that meeting, the jammed agenda was that the meeting of the members of the protocol had to put in place all of the mechanisms to make this thing work.